Grüß, willkommen in einem neuen video. Welcome to another exciting video, in this case part 61 of my game system design series. In this video I'll be discussing the seductive and disappointing world of army lists. Within this video I'll be covering all army lists ranging from ancients, musket and pike, World War II and Cold War. The period is not really significant. It's the initial seduction of any army list to any gamer, followed by the disappointing when you discover it did not solve all the problems that you visualized that it would solve that I'm covering. So, with that out of the way, let's first enter the seductive world of army lists, and I can assure you, army lists can be rather seductive to many gamers for many different reasons. Any new gamer will initially focus on the figures followed by the rules. This will result in a period of learning the rules and also a period where the gamer will learn exactly how much time is necessary to build up their force mix, as well as of course learning the set of rules. This learning process could be solo, that is by themselves, or could involve other gamers teaching you the ropes, both what figures to buy and also how to learn the rules. This process can actually be quite enjoyable, but eventually you'll come up with two major issues. Building up a force mix which makes sense for your game, building up a force mix for a game which works. Let's first look at building up a force mix which makes sense for your game and identify what the issues are. Often gamers will purchase the figures they like, which will result, or the result normally is that they end up with a force mix which makes no sense at all. Ancient armies which consist of hordes of elephants, Napoleonic armies which seem to mainly consist of cuirassiers or guards, World War II armies which seem to only include Tiger tanks, and Cold War armies which only seem to field M1 Abrams main battle tanks. If the rules being used are good, such unbalanced force mixes will generally result in losing every game. Gamers often overcome this by creating their own rules, which make it possible for a huge cuirassier army to defeat infantry in a built-up area. However, I'll not be covering those cases and will assume the rules make some form of historical sense, in which case the cuirassiers will never be able to dislodge infantry from buildings. Eventually, and this may take a long time or it may be very short, gamers will want to create something which is historically reasonable, which means they now need to buy all those boring troop types they never had much interest in buying previously. The Napoleonic gamer starts buying hordes of Landwehr, the World War II gamer starts buying boring old infantry, and the ancient gamer starts buying mass spearmen or levies. The final result is a gamer's force mix will end up including a lot of carefully painted figures which will end up never being used. I have enough cuirassiers to represent all the Prussian cuirassier force mixes at a very low scale, and these days rarely use more than 10% of this total number. As a result, the gamers become more focused on making sure they initially buy the correct force mix, one which they actually use for most games, because having figures that you don't use eventually starts really annoying you. There are various methods you can adopt which reduce force mix wastage, some of which I've covered in earlier videos, but one way of achieving this is through the use of army lists. This does require selecting a set of rules first, but if this is possible, then all you need is the army list, which you can now use to build out your force mix, achieving a low level of figure wastage. The second issue that you'll come up with is building up a force mix for a game which works. This is normally an issue for gamers who wish to have a game which completes within a day and which has a clear winner and loser. In this case, the gamer already has the figures. He just wants to know what he can deploy for this particular game, which has clear and well-defined victory conditions and which gives both players an even chance of victory, with only skill differentiating both players. One solution is historical scenarios, which does work, but does require a different type of army list, which is the force mix for that specific scenario or historical battle. Another possible solution is a point system, where each player deploys a fixed points total on the playing area. This does require a point system, but even if one exists, both players will be spending time with their calculator building up their force mix. The other issue is some guidelines of what each side should look like is required, so we can avoid the opposite of my cuirassier in a built-up area issue, where some gimmicky troop type is identified and that's all people field. The other issue is no point system in a set of rules is going to be perfect. There will always be gamey aspects to the point system. One way of minimising this is to use historical force mixes. Thus, if infantry armed with ATGWs have an unusually powerful impact, the historical limits will restrict their deployment. You can even take this to each player selecting a fixed formation with points values and a fixed composition. Such, for example, a battalion. This works with World War II or Cold War, but is generally not that effective with musket and pikes or ancients. The answer is, of course, an army list or a scenario force mix. Putting the scenario force mix to one side, an army list will restrict your force mix to something which resembles reality, minimising any issues with the point system and hopefully allowing you to move to quickly form up your force mix for your ad hoc game. That kind of ends the army list seduction zone. Now let's look at the army list disappointment zone. My first exposure to an army list was Ian Shaw's first edition of the World War II Army Organisation and Equipment books. This was published in 1981 and I used it to build up forces for my WRG World War II Micro Armour games. These initial army lists consisted of a TOE with the equipment under each formation, as you can see here. The player was expected to use this to build up an army list or force mix and then to cross-reference the elements with the points charts also contained in the army list book. This worked, but was very much designed for players, or force players to study the charts and build up their army in their man cave well before selling out to do battle in a club. It was suitable for competitions, but for an ad hoc game, less than useful. The second edition of Ian Shaw's book, which came out in 1983, improved this situation by providing some traditional army list guidelines, as you can see here. Players could now build up their force mix based on some general guidelines, which made the job of creating their force mix a lot easier, but it still required some effort to create your force mix. Good for competition games, but still not really good for ad hoc games. The third edition of this army list book, which came out in 1986, expanded on this trend and provided more fine-grained options for players. So now a British player could form an army that was possibly common in 1940 in France, or 1940 in the desert, or 1941 in the desert, so on and so forth. The basic structure was continued for World War II and Cold War figure gaming until, recently. But in all cases, it had a fundamental issue, which was some effort was required to build up your force mix from the book, which was best done before the game was to be played. Good for competition, but not good for ad hoc games. Generally, the old army book trend for World War II and Cold War tended not to be very successful. And what actually became far more successful was scenarios with fixed forces, maps and victory conditions. These did work, but removed the excitement of building up your own personal force mix and experiencing a new and random situation. When I moved over to Napoleonic gaming, the army lists I used were the Horse and Musket Army list printed in 1979 and designed for the WRG Napoleonic rules. These were similar to the latter Ian Shaw World War II lists and provided a player with a reasonably fixed list with some variation allowed, although it was not a great deal of variability, great for competitions, and even reasonable for ad hoc games because of its simplicity. However, while this did work for competition games quite well, and I think that's why the army lists were initially printed, and could work with ad hoc, it was never really that good for ad hoc games. Still took too much effort to build up your force mix on the day. Thus, the trend in this, once again, moved to historical scenarios. I suspect for the same reason World War II moved in that direction. After my sallying with Napoleonics, I moved to Ancients. My initial exposure to Ancients was an Australian set of rules called Anabasis. I only got involved in Ancients because of a campaign, and I just used the rules everyone else did. The campaign did not require an army list, but for ad hoc games, the rules do contain a rough army list. This did not contain points values, and as much had minimal use, except as an idea of what troop types you could field in a specific army. The other set of rules that I not so commonly use was the WRG Ancient, specifically or initially 6th edition, and discovered a plethora of army lists in that world. The format was much the same as the Napoleonic format, but contained a huge array of different ancient armies with different options. Unlike musket and pike, World War II and Cold War, army lists became the norm for ancients. I expect a lack of good scenario details for ancient battles could be the reason why historical battles never really took off. But the final result from WRG was an impressive body of work. I used these army lists for other rules, ancient rules, and certainly used the army list to determine what figures I need to purchase if I want to purchase or build up a new ancient army. The issue with spending too much time creating your army or force mix still existed, although in the ancient world the common methodology was to build up a WRG army and just stay with it with minimal modification. A few extra units may be included which could easily be swapped out or in before a game, but gamers would arrive with their Athenian Greek hoplite army and just use their standard force mix of a specific points total to game it out with, let's say, a medieval army. This methodology does seem to work reasonably well with DBMM or even the earlier DBM, and also with their own specific army lists, the quick play DBA. However, many players, while they may like the army list, may not like the rules. So when they moved to another set of rules, they needed to align with another army list. This was generally not a major issue, but nonetheless was something to take into a note. And it was interesting, the other rules adopted the same army list focused approach that DBM or WRG used. I have to admit that if you're looking at the world of ancient figure gaming, the army list approach does not disappoint. You can get all the seduction you want with only minimal disappointment, but this is mainly due to players using fixed force mixes. This allows them to have that all-important ad hoc game with a clear winner and loser at a club without spending an enormous amount of time building up their force mix before they even move any figures or spin a dice. I normally use, for myself, a figure game conversion of an SPI board game, which uses DBMM troop types and points values, and even in this case I tend to only field fixed force mixes. In the cases that you see here are my fixed force mixes for a 200-point army, in this case New Kingdom and Hittite Empire. Creating a fixed army list or force mix, as I've described, does allow you to build out your new army with minimal wastage. In this case, let's look at Book 1, Army List 24, the Hittite Empire 1380 BC to 1170 BC. While 200 points is the most common for me, it's not for other sets of rules. It may be better to build out a 300 point or even 400 point force mix, as this allows you the greatest flexibility if you want to play DBMM games, which typically I normally play at the 300 to 400 point mark, or if I go to my own board game conversion set of rules, P17CW, which I normally use 200 points. It doesn't really matter, but I build out my army list based on this fixed force mix. In this case, you only need to purchase, paint and base 62 elements if you're using the 300 points version, and that gets you an army in a state to play a game of DBMM, DBM, or P17CW. It's also likely suitable for many other rules as well. While the army list and points-based system is the main way people play Ancients, there are other sets of rules where the scenario or historical scenarios are used. Some effort was made at creating historical scenarios out of the UK, particularly at university, such as Philip Sabin's Lost Battle and Legion. However, these are first board games which can actually use figures more as an optional extra rather than actually being pure figure gaming sets of rules. Nonetheless, they work quite well. Lost Battle has a long list of historical scenarios, but when you play the game, you quickly realise that because we lack so much information about the ancient period, the scenarios are very generic. The rules that I initially converted from a board game to figure game also uses the historical scenario basic idea, with SPI pre-stag board game converted into a figure gaming format and using DBMM troop types, also possibly used to recreate historical battles. These rules were actually originally designed for historical scenarios. However, the issue with historical scenarios need to be considered. Lack of repeatability and a predictable situation. And even with pre-stags, when you go through the scenarios, and this was designed quite a few years ago, you can quickly identify so many problems with the historical force mixes. because we keep on learning about ancient battles almost every year, and we simply lack enough information to pin down all the detail necessary to create a really robust historical scenarios. But put that to one side, even if you could do that, players do like the random and unexpected sort of world that point system games normally provide in the ancient world. And as a result, I use DBMM army lists with points, with this rules, and with a fixed force mix. But putting the ancient world to one side, in the world of musket and pike, World War II and Cold War, the standard games are typically fixed scenarios with all their respective advantages and disadvantages. This is because of the disappointment of army lists. Unless you want to go down the ancients path and just create a single force mix with minimal variation, the issue with the army lists are significant. For an ad hoc game, it simply takes too much time to build up an army. Let's look at an example from WRG Micro Armour. If you wish to build up a 1000 point force mix from this, you can, but it will take some time and a calculator. A motor rifle company plus the compulsory troops is about the easiest option. But if you want any tanks, you'll need to get your notepad out and your calculator out and start calculating. I used to use a spreadsheet to calculate my force mix, and I had to do this well before any game I played, normally the day before, if not before. You need to go down the path of pre-baking your army list, similar to ancients, to make army lists work in this case. This proves an issue with World War II or Cold War simply because of the complexity of modern warfare, something that the ancient world doesn't really have to face. I have most of the Napoleonic Wars battles army lists in a spreadsheet and can quickly and easily create an army list for about a dozen different sets of rules and a dozen different sets of battles. But even if we look at this simple example, it would take time for a player to create, let's say, a 20-point army. You could add a 9-point and an 11-point core together to get your 20 points, but you need to manually remove 1 point of forces from this so you can put your C&C in. This is actually probably on retrospect viable because the point systems are so incredibly low and we are dealing with a historically accurate TOE. It's probably reasonably easy, but let's look at something a little bit more complex. If we decide to use WRG musket and pike rules, the complexity does go up a lot. Creating a 2000 point army list will take some time in this particular case and would need your trusty calculator in order to do so. However, even in this case, the effort may not be insurmountable. However, it should be noted, these are not traditional army lists. These are TOEs from Nearhorster converted into an army list format which can be used by figure gamers. It's a much more restrictive list for you to select and thus probably is more viable. Let's take a look at this in more detail. Unlike an army list which has to give players significant variability in order to represent a wide range of different battles, we can pick a single battle, in this case Marengo, and simply use the formations contained in that battle only. You'll probably go over your limit and thus you'll need to know the cost of individual elements so you can remove them and bring the total down to whatever you've agreed. But it's possible. In this example, I can quickly arrive at an army which is reasonably close to 2000 points, and assuming in this particular case all my troops are trained, that's what I'm using here. If we move over to World War II, in this World War II example, we're using spearhead rules and are building a 500-point force mix from a US infantry division, November 1942. A very fixed sort of army list. 2 infantry battalions and required HQ gives us 250 points. 1 artillery battalion and tank destroyer battalion gives us an additional 150 points, giving us a force mix which is pretty close to 400. It's not that difficult. However, once again, this is not a traditional army list. This is a fixed structure, in this case a US infantry division, North Africa in November 1942. As a general rule of thumb, a traditional army list, similar to those found in ancient games, are not very popular among musket and pike, World War II and Cold War gamers, simply because it's actually a lot more complex. However, using actual TOEs may allow players to quickly create ad hoc games using something similar to an army list, but it's a much more restrictive army list. The other alternative, which is my current preferred alternative, is to use a random card pick system. In this case, players randomly select cards, modifying their entry game turn, or modifying the entry game turn of that card, which affects their points, and builds up a force mix and reinforcement schedule. This is the easiest system to allow players to create ad hoc force mixes. It only takes about 5-10 minutes at the most. But in order to keep both sides even, some modification of the actual historical forces would be required. So, for example, in the case of the Austrians on the right, some of the core size formations had to be beefed up a bit so I could get the correct total points list of all 9 cards. While I initially started this video with the thought that army lists generally disappoint, even after the initial excitement of discovering them, with the exception of Ancients, my thoughts have altered a bit. For Ancients, I can now see how army lists do work and are the preferred method to set up ad hoc games, as long as you fix your army with only some minor modification permitted. For Musket and Pike, World War II and Cold War, this approach may work at a low scale, squad or etc., or even skirmish, such as when an element equals a vehicle or 10 men, but once you move up to a higher scale of, let's say, one element equals a company, it falls apart because of the complexity of those periods. So army lists generally don't work in those periods. On the other hand, presenting a historical force mix which players can select from with only a minimal amount of variability may be a viable method of quickly building a force mix, especially for Musket and Pike. For World War II and Cold War, this could also be possible, although I suspect it may only work if you're using a very high-scale set of rules, such as an element equals a company. After creating this video, I may well convert my spreadsheet-based army lists into army lists for rules, which can be used by players to quickly put together a force mix using a army list, as distinct from my random card selection. At least that's my current thought. I'm not sure if I'll ever actually complete that project. And so this concludes part 61 of my video on game system design, in this case looking at army lists, their seductive appeal, and a bit of history and their all too common disappointment. Alle guten Dinge kommen zu einem Ende.